Lost girl in the snow, millionaire in shock. The decision no one expected will change everything. Before we get into it, let's make this moment global. Leave a comment in your own language. The December wind howled like a wounded beast through the streets of Chicago, turning what should have been a 15-minute drive into a nightmare of white fury. Richard Wellington gripped the leather steering wheel of his black Bentley, his knuckles pale against the storm's rage. At 58, he had weathered many storms in his life. Hostile takeovers, bitter divorces, corporate scandals, but Mother Nature seemed determined to remind him that some forces remained beyond his control. "Damn weather," he muttered, squinting through the windshield as his wipers struggled against the relentless snow. The radio crackled with emergency warnings, advising all drivers to stay off the roads. But Richard Wellington didn't take advice from anyone. As CEO of Wellington Technologies, he had built a billion-dollar empire by making decisions when others hesitated, by pushing forward when others retreated. The Christmas party at the Fairmont Hotel had been another tedious affair. Handshakes with politicians, forced smiles with competitors, and hollow conversations about quarterly projections. Richard had left early, as he always did. Social gatherings were business necessities, nothing more. He had no family waiting at home, no children eager to hear about his day, no wife to warm his bed. That chapter of his life had closed 8 years ago when Margaret walked out, taking half his assets and whatever remained of his capacity for trust. As he navigated the deserted streets, his phone buzzed with messages from his assistant, probably about tomorrow's board meeting or some crisis that couldn't wait until morning. Richard Wellington's world never stopped spinning, never paused for something as inconvenient as a blizzard. Time was money, and money was power, and power was the only thing that mattered in... A flash of color in his peripheral vision made him slam on the brakes. The Bentley skidded slightly before coming to a stop, its heated seats and climate control a stark contrast to the chaos outside. Richard wiped the fog from his window and leaned forward, certain his eyes were playing tricks on him. There, barely visible through the swirling snow, was a small figure in a bright red coat. A child. A little girl, no more than 7 or 8 years old, stumbling through the storm with no adult in sight. What the hell? Richard whispered, his business-hardened heart skipping a beat. He looked around for parents, for someone, anyone who might be responsible for this child, but the streets were empty except for the relentless snow and the ghostly glow of streetlights. The girl stumbled and fell, her small body disappearing momentarily into a snowdrift. She struggled to her feet, and even from inside his warm car, Richard could see she was crying. Her movements were sluggish, the telltale signs of hypothermia beginning to set in. Richard's first instinct was to call 911 and drive away. He was not a hero, not a savior. He was a businessman with a reputation to protect and a schedule to maintain. Getting involved with a lost child would mean police reports, questions, delays. His lawyers would have nightmares about the liability issues alone. But as he reached for his phone, the girl looked directly at him. Even through the storm, even across the distance, her blue eyes seemed to pierce right through the windshield and into whatever remained of his soul. There was no fear in those eyes, only hope, pure, innocent hope, that someone, that he, would help her. "Shit," Richard said, his hand freezing over the phone. He had seen that look before, years ago, in the mirror of his childhood bedroom when his own father would come home drunk and violent. The desperate hope that someone, anyone, would save him. The girl stumbled again, this time falling harder. She didn't get up as quickly. Richard Wellington, the man who had fired over 200 employees without blinking, who had foreclosed on struggling businesses without losing sleep, who had built walls around his heart so thick that nothing could penetrate them, did something that surprised even himself. He opened the car door. The cold hit him like a physical blow, instantly penetrating his expensive wool coat and Italian leather shoes. The wind tried to push him back toward the warmth of his car, but Richard pushed forward, his designer clothing utterly inadequate for the storm's fury. "Hey!" he called out, his voice nearly lost in the wind. "Little girl!" She looked up at him with those impossibly blue eyes, and Richard felt something crack inside his chest. She was beautiful in the way only children could be, innocent, trusting, unmarked by the cruelties of the world. Her lips were blue with cold, her small hands red and chapped. Icicles hung from her blonde hair like tiny ornaments. "Are you okay?" Richard asked, kneeling beside her in the snow. It was a stupid question. She was clearly not okay, but he didn't know what else to say. He hadn't spoken to a child in years. "I can't find my daddy," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm. "He's lost, and I have to find him." Richard's heart did something strange, something it hadn't done in decades. It hurt, not the sharp pain of a heart attack or the dull ache of heartburn, but the deep, soul-crushing pain of empathy. This child was alone in the storm, searching for someone who was probably warm and safe somewhere, unaware that his daughter was freezing to death in the worst blizzard Chicago had seen in 50 years. "What's your name, sweetheart?" The endearment slipped out before Richard could stop it, surprising them both. "Emma," she said, her teeth chattering so violently she could barely speak. "Emma Collins, my daddy. He went to look for work today, but he didn't come home. Mommy's not here anymore, so it's just me and Daddy, and I have to find him." Collins. The name triggered a memory, but Richard pushed it aside. Right now, all that mattered was getting this child somewhere warm before she died of exposure. "Emma, I'm Richard. I'm going to help you find your daddy, but first we need to get you warm. My car has heat, and we can call the police to help us look for him. Does that sound okay?" Emma nodded, too cold and too tired to argue. Richard scooped her into his arms, surprised by how light she was, how fragile. As he carried her toward his car, he couldn't shake the feeling that this moment, this decision to help instead of drive away, would change everything. The warm interior of the Bentley enveloped them like a cocoon. Richard set Emma gently in the passenger seat and cranked up the heat, then fumbled in the glove compartment for the emergency blanket his driver had insisted on keeping there. As he wrapped it around Emma's small shoulders, she looked up at him with those trusting blue eyes. "Thank you, Mr. Richard," she whispered. "I knew someone would help me. Daddy always says there are good people in the world, even when things seem really bad." Richard's throat tightened. When was the last time someone had called him good? When was the last time he had done something purely to help another person, with no thought of profit or advantage? "Let's call the police now," he said, reaching for his phone. But as he dialed, a part of him wondered if he was ready for what came next, because something told him that Emma Collins was going to turn his carefully ordered world upside down, and there would be no going back. As the phone rang, Emma curled up in the warm seat, finally safe from the storm. She didn't know that the man who had saved her was about to discover that sometimes the people we save end up saving us instead. The Chicago Police Department's 18th District looked like a war zone. Emergency vehicles lined the streets, their red and blue lights painting the falling snow in patriotic colors. Inside, the precinct buzzed with controlled chaos, officers fielding calls about stranded motorists, downed power lines, and missing persons. Detective Maria Santos hadn't seen a storm this bad since the blizzard of '99, and that one had claimed 12 lives. Richard Wellington sat in an uncomfortable plastic chair beside the detective's desk, his expensive suit looking absurdly out of place in the government-issued furniture landscape. Emma Collins slept against his shoulder, wrapped in a police department blanket, her tiny fingers clutching his silk tie like a lifeline. For the past 2 hours, Richard had found himself in the surreal position of being responsible for another human being, a feeling both terrifying and oddly comforting. "Mr. Wellington," Detective Santos said, returning from another phone call. She was a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and the tired expression of someone who had seen too much human suffering. "I have some information about Emma's father." Richard gently shifted Emma so she could continue sleeping while he listened. The little girl murmured something in her sleep about finding Daddy, and Richard's chest tightened with an emotion he couldn't name. "James Collins, 35 years old, last known address on Ashland Avenue," Santos continued, consulting her notes. "He's been looking for work since he lost his job about 6 months ago. Neighbors say he left this morning for a job interview downtown and never came back. With this storm, he could be stuck anywhere." 6 months ago. The timeline triggered another memory fragment in Richard's mind, but he pushed it down. Right now, all that mattered was reuniting Emma with her father. "What about her mother?" Richard asked quietly, careful not to wake the sleeping child. Detective Santos's expression softened. "Sarah Collins died 2 years ago. Breast cancer. Medical bills wiped out their savings, and James has been struggling to make ends meet ever since. According to the neighbors, he's a good father devoted to Emma, but, well, times have been tough." Richard studied Emma's peaceful face as she slept. Even in sleep, she looked older than her 7 years, the kind of premature wisdom that came from watching a parent suffer and die, from learning too young that the world could be cruel and unfair. "The storm's expected to continue through the night," Santos continued. "We've got search teams out, but with visibility near zero and temperatures dropping to dangerous levels, it's going to be difficult to locate Mr. Collins until morning." "What happens to Emma in the meantime?" Richard heard himself ask. "Child Services will place her in emergency foster care until we can locate her father or—" "No!" The word came out sharper than Richard intended, and Emma stirred in his arms. He lowered his voice. "I mean, is that necessary? She's been through enough trauma for one night." Detective Santos studied Richard with curious eyes. "Mr. Wellington, you've already done more than most people would. You saved her life out there, but you're not family, and we have protocols." "I understand protocols," Richard said, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to getting his way. "But look at her. She's finally sleeping peacefully. Why traumatize her further by placing her with strangers when she could stay somewhere comfortable until her father is found?" Santos leaned back in her chair. "Are you suggesting that Emma stay with you, Mr. Wellington?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Richard Wellington, who had spent 30 years avoiding emotional entanglements, who had chosen career over family and profit over people, was proposing to take responsibility for a 7-year-old girl he'd known for 3 hours. "My home is warm, safe, and certainly large enough," Richard said, surprised by his own words. "I have a live-in housekeeper who could help care for Emma, and I give you my word that she'll be treated well." "Daddy?" Emma's sleepy voice interrupted their conversation. She looked around the police station with confused, frightened eyes. "Where's my daddy?" Richard's heart broke a little more. "Hey, Emma, remember me?" "Richard? We're at the police station, and these nice officers are helping us look for your daddy." "Is he okay?" she asked, her lower lip trembling. "The storm was so scary, and he's been gone all day." "I'm sure he's fine," Richard said, hoping his voice sounded more confident than he felt. "Sometimes adults get stuck in bad weather, but that doesn't mean they're hurt. The police are very good at finding people." Emma nodded solemnly, then looked around the busy police station. "It's loud here," she whispered. "Yes, it is," Richard agreed. "Would you like to come to my house where it's quiet and warm? Just until the police find your daddy?" Emma considered this seriously, studying Richard's face with those penetrating blue eyes. "Will you help them look for him?" "Absolutely," Richard promised, and he meant it. "Okay," Emma said simply, then snuggled back against his shoulder with the absolute trust that only children possessed. Detective Santos watched this exchange with growing amazement. In 20 years of police work, she had seen wealthy businessmen treat missing children like inconvenient obstacles to their busy schedules. Richard Wellington was different, though she couldn't quite put her finger on why. "There would be conditions," Santos said finally. "Child Services would need to approve the arrangement. There would be check-ins, paperwork, background verification. Whatever you need," Richard said. "I just want to help." 2 hours later, Richard found himself standing in the marble foyer of his Lincoln Park mansion, watching Emma Collins take in her surroundings with wide eyes. The house was a monument to his success. 15,000 square feet of perfect architecture, priceless art, and carefully curated luxury. But seeing it through Emma's eyes, Richard suddenly realized how cold and unwelcoming it felt. "It's like a palace," Emma whispered, her voice echoing slightly in the vast space. "It's just a house," Richard said. But even as he spoke, he wondered when he had stopped thinking of it as a home. Mrs. Chen, his housekeeper, appeared as if summoned. The 60-year-old woman had worked for Richard for 12 years, maintaining his perfect life with quiet efficiency. She had seen him through his divorce, his business crises, and his gradual transformation from a driven young entrepreneur into an isolated, emotionally distant billionaire. But she had never seen him with a child. "Mrs. Chen, this is Emma," Richard said. "She'll be staying with us tonight while the police locate her father." Mrs. Chen's practiced composure slipped for just a moment as she took in the sight of her employer holding a small child's hand. Then she smiled, the first genuine smile Richard had seen from her in years. "Hello, Emma," Mrs. Chen said warmly. "Are you hungry? I was just making some hot chocolate." Emma's face lit up for the first time since Richard had found her. "Yes, please. Daddy and I love hot chocolate, especially when it's snowy outside." As Mrs. Chen led Emma toward the kitchen, chattering about marshmallows and cookies, Richard stood alone in his foyer and tried to process what had happened to his life in the span of a few hours. He had gone from being a man who measured his worth in quarterly profits to someone responsible for the safety and happiness of a 7-year-old child. His phone buzzed with messages from his office, questions that needed answers, decisions that needed making. But for the first time in decades, Richard Wellington ignored his phone. Instead, he followed the sound of Emma's laughter toward the kitchen, drawn by something he hadn't felt in so long he'd almost forgotten what to call it: hope. Later that evening, after Emma had fallen asleep in the guest bedroom that Mrs. Chen had hastily prepared, Richard sat in his study, staring at his computer screen. He had been trying to focus on work, but his mind kept drifting to the little girl sleeping upstairs. Something about her father's name, James Collins, continued to nag at him. Finally, unable to concentrate, Richard opened his company's employment database and typed in the name. What he found made his blood run cold. James Collins. Hired as a software engineer 18 months ago, terminated 6 months ago due to restructuring and cost-cutting measures. The termination had been signed off by Richard himself, part of a mass layoff designed to boost quarterly profits and appease shareholders. Richard stared at the screen, pieces of a horrible puzzle clicking into place. Emma's father wasn't just any missing person. He was a man Richard had personally destroyed, a man who had lost his job, his insurance, his ability to provide for his daughter, all because Richard Wellington had decided that labor costs needed to be reduced. The irony was almost too cruel to believe. The little girl sleeping peacefully upstairs, The child who had looked at him with such trust and called him good was the daughter of a man whose life Richard had casually ruined with the stroke of a pen. Richard sat back in his leather chair, his hands shaking slightly. For the first time in his adult life, he was faced with the human cost of his business decisions. It wasn't just numbers on a spreadsheet or statistics in a quarterly report. It was Emma Collins, sleeping alone in a strange house because her father was out in a blizzard, probably desperate and homeless, searching for work to feed his daughter. A soft knock at his study door interrupted his thoughts. Mrs. Chen stood in the doorway, her expression unreadable. "Emma woke up crying," she said quietly. "She's asking for you." Richard found Emma sitting up in the guest bed, tears streaming down her cheeks. The room was warm and comfortable, filled with luxury that most children could only dream of, but Emma looked lost and frightened. "I had a bad dream," she whispered as Richard sat on the edge of the bed. "I dreamed that Daddy couldn't find his way home and I was all alone forever." The words hit Richard like a physical blow. "You're not alone, Emma. I'm here and Mrs. Chen is here and the police are still looking for your daddy." "But what if they don't find him?" Emma asked, her blue eyes wide with a fear that no 7-year-old should have to carry. "What if he's lost forever like Mommy?" Richard felt something break inside his chest. This child had already lost her mother, already learned that the people she loved could disappear forever. Now she was facing the possibility of losing her father too, and it was partly Richard's fault. "They'll find him," Richard said, his voice thick with emotion he couldn't hide. "I promise you, Emma, we'll find your daddy." Emma studied his face seriously, then reached out and took his hand with her small, warm fingers. "You're sad too," she said, with the startling perception that children sometimes possessed. "Are you missing someone?" The question caught Richard off guard. Was he missing someone? He thought of his ex-wife Margaret, but realized he felt nothing for her anymore. He thought of his parents, both long dead, but their absence was an old wound, scarred over and forgotten. He thought of friends, but realized he had none, only business associates and social acquaintances. "I guess I'm missing the person I used to be," Richard said, surprising himself with his honesty. Emma nodded solemnly. "Sometimes I miss the little girl I was before Mommy got sick. But Daddy says we carry the best parts of who we used to be with us always, and we can become new people too, out of the mouths of babes." Richard squeezed Emma's hand gently. "Your daddy sounds like a very wise man." "He is," Emma said proudly. "He reads me stories every night, and he makes funny voices for all the characters. When I have bad dreams, he tells me about all the good things that are going to happen tomorrow." Richard felt another crack in the walls around his heart. "Would you like me to tell you about the good things that are going to happen tomorrow?" Emma nodded eagerly, settling back against her pillows. "Well," Richard began, feeling awkward but determined, "tomorrow the storm will stop, and the sun will come out. The police will find your daddy, and you'll be together again. And maybe we'll all be a little bit different than we were before. Sometimes the hardest days teach us the most important things." Emma smiled sleepily. "That's a good story, Mr. Richard. Will you stay until I fall asleep?" "Of course," Richard said, and he did. He sat beside Emma's bed until her breathing deepened and her small hand relaxed in his. Then he sat there longer, watching her peaceful face and thinking about the choices that had brought them both to this moment. Tomorrow, he would have to tell her the truth about her father. Tomorrow, he would have to face the consequences of his actions. But tonight, for the first time in decades, Richard Wellington felt something he had thought was lost forever, the desire to be a better man than he had been yesterday. Dawn broke grey and cold over Chicago, the blizzard finally exhausted after 12 hours of fury. Richard Wellington stood at his kitchen window, watching the sunrise paint the snow-covered city in shades of pink and gold. He had barely slept. his mind churning with the discovery that Emma's father was one of his terminated employees. The coffee in his hand had gone cold an hour ago, but he barely noticed. "Mr. Richard." Emma's voice behind him was soft and uncertain. She stood in the kitchen doorway, wearing one of his old T-shirts as a makeshift nightgown, her blonde hair tousled from sleep. "Did they find my daddy?" Richard's heart clenched. He had been dreading this conversation all night, practicing different ways to explain that her father was still missing. But looking at Emma's hopeful face, he realized that the truth, or at least part of it, was all he could offer. "Not yet, sweetheart," he said gently, kneeling to her level. "But the storm stopped, so the police can search better now." Emma's face fell, but she nodded bravely. "Daddy always says that patient people get the best surprises." Mrs. Chen bustled into the kitchen, taking in the scene with knowing eyes. She had worked for wealthy families her entire career, and she recognized the look on Richard's face, the expression of a man whose life was changing in ways he couldn't control. "Good morning, little one," Mrs. Chen said warmly. "How about some pancakes? I think we all need something special this morning." As Mrs. Chen began preparing breakfast, Richard's phone rang. Detective Santos's name appeared on the screen, and Richard felt his stomach drop. He answered quickly, stepping into the hallway for privacy. "Mr. Wellington, we found James Collins," Santos said without preamble. Richard's relief was immediate and overwhelming. "Is he—" "He's alive," Santos said quickly, "but he's in the hospital. Exposure and dehydration. He was found unconscious in Grant Park about 2 hours ago. A jogger spotted him and called 911. "How bad is it?" Richard asked, his mind racing ahead to how he would explain this to Emma. "He'll recover," Santos assured him. "He's conscious now, and he's been asking about Emma non-stop. We told him she's safe, but he wants to see her." "Of course," Richard said. "We'll come to the hospital right away." "There's something else," Santos added, her tone careful. "Mr. Collins, he's been living in his car, Mr. Wellington, has been for about a month now. Lost his apartment when he couldn't make rent. He was at that job interview yesterday, his last lead for work. When the storm hit, he got disoriented trying to get back to where he'd parked." The words hit Richard like a physical blow. James Collins had been homeless, living in his car with winter approaching, while Richard lived in a 15,000-square-foot mansion. The man had been at a job interview, desperately trying to rebuild his life, when the storm had nearly killed him. "I understand," Richard said quietly. "We'll be there within the hour." Richard hung up and stood in the hallway for a moment, gathering himself. Then he returned to the kitchen, where Emma was carefully cutting her pancakes into precise squares, a habit that reminded him painfully of his own childhood need for control in an uncontrollable world. "Emma," he said gently, sitting beside her, "that was the police. They found your daddy." Emma's fork clattered to her plate. "Is he okay?" "He's in the hospital, but he's going to be fine," Richard said quickly. "He got very cold in the storm, so the doctors are helping him get warm and healthy again." "Would you like to go see him?" Emma's face lit up like Christmas morning. "Yes, can we go right now?" "As soon as you finish breakfast," Richard promised. "Mrs. Chen packed some clothes for you to change into." An hour later, they were walking through the sterile corridors of Northwestern Memorial Hospital. Emma held Richard's hand tightly, her small face serious with concern. Richard had called ahead to speak with the attending physician, using his influence to ensure that James Collins was receiving the best possible care. It was the least he could do. Room 314 was quiet, except for the steady beep of monitoring equipment. James Collins lay in the hospital bed, IV lines in his arm, his face pale but alert. He was younger than Richard had expected, probably mid-30s, with Emma's blue eyes and blonde hair. Despite his ordeal, he was handsome in the way that suggested he had once been confident and successful before life had beaten him down. "Daddy!" Emma cried, rushing to the bed. James's face transformed with joy and relief as he carefully gathered his daughter into a gentle hug, mindful of his IV lines. "Oh, sweetheart," James whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I was so scared. I tried to get home to you, but the storm was so bad, and I got lost and—" "It's okay, Daddy," Emma said, patting his cheek with her small hand. "Mr. Richard saved me. He found me in the snow and took care of me all night." James looked up at Richard for the first time, and Richard saw recognition flicker in his eyes. It was subtle, a slight tensing around the eyes, a carefully controlled expression, but Richard knew that James Collins remembered exactly who had signed his termination papers. "Mr. Wellington," James said carefully, his voice neutral, "thank you for helping Emma. I don't know how to thank you, too." The words were polite, proper, but Richard could hear the underlying tension. James Collins was a man who had lost everything, including his dignity, and now he owed a debt of gratitude to the person who had helped destroy his life. "Anyone would have done the same," Richard said, though they both knew that wasn't true. "No," James said firmly, his arm tightening protectively around Emma. "Not anyone. You could have just called the police and driven away. Instead, you stayed with her, brought her to your home, made sure she was safe. That's more than most people would do." Emma looked between her father and Richard with the intuitive sense that children possessed when adults were having a conversation on multiple levels. "Daddy, Mr. Richard has a really big house, and Mrs. Chen made pancakes, and he stayed with me when I had a bad dream." "Did he?" James said softly, his eyes never leaving Richard's face. "That was very kind of him." A doctor entered the room, breaking the tension. Dr. Sarah Martinez was a woman in her 40s with competent hands and kind eyes. She nodded politely to Richard before addressing James. "Mr. Collins, your test results look good. The hypothermia was moderate, and you'll make a full recovery. We'd like to keep you for observation for another day or two, just to be safe." "I can't afford," James began, panic creeping into his voice. "It's covered," Richard said quickly. "I've spoken with the hospital administration. All of your medical expenses are taken care of." James stared at Richard with an expression Richard couldn't read. "That's not necessary, Mr. Wellington. I don't need charity." The word charity hung between them like a challenge. Richard understood. James Collins was a proud man who had already lost too much. The last thing he wanted was to be treated like an object of pity by the man who had helped put him in this position. "It's not charity," Richard said carefully. "It's responsibility. Emma was in my care, and I want to make sure her father is healthy and able to take care of her." Emma looked confused by the sudden tension in the room. "Daddy, why are you upset? Mr. Richard is being nice." James's expression softened as he looked at his daughter. "You're right, sweetheart. I'm sorry. I'm just tired." Dr. Martinez, sensing the undercurrents she didn't understand, focused on her medical duties. "Mr. Collins, I also want to discuss Emma's medical history while you're here. Her school records indicate she's been having some health issues." James's face went pale. "She's been having headaches lately, and sometimes she gets dizzy or confused. I've been meaning to take her to a doctor, but without insurance." "What kind of headaches?" Dr. Martinez asked, her professional concern evident. "Bad ones," Emma said matter-of-factly. "Sometimes I can't see very well, and the room spins around. But I don't tell Daddy because it makes him worry." Richard felt ice form in his stomach as he watched Dr. Martinez's expression change. The doctor was trying to hide her concern, but Richard had seen that look before, the carefully neutral expression that medical professionals wore when they suspected something serious. "I'd like to run some tests on Emma while you're both here," Dr. Martinez said carefully, "just to rule out anything serious. With your permission, of course." James looked stricken. "Tests cost money, and I don't have—" "They're covered too," Richard said immediately. "Whatever Emma needs." This time, James didn't argue about charity. His parental instincts had kicked in, overriding his pride. "What kind of tests?" "Nothing invasive," Dr. Martinez assured him. "Some blood work, maybe an MRI to check for any structural issues. Headaches in children can be caused by many things: stress, eye strain, dehydration. But given her symptoms, I'd like to be thorough." Richard watched Emma's small face as the adults discussed her health, and he saw something that chilled him to the bone. She wasn't surprised by this conversation. This little girl had been hiding her pain, protecting her father from another worry he couldn't afford to fix. "Will it hurt?" Emma asked quietly. "Not at all," Dr. Martinez promised. "We'll take good care of you." As the doctor left to arrange the tests, the room fell into uncomfortable silence. James held Emma close, his face a mask of barely controlled fear. Richard stood by the window, feeling utterly helpless, despite his wealth and influence. "Mr. Wellington," James said finally, his voice carefully controlled. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." Richard turned to face him, his stomach clenching with dread. "Why are you really doing this?" James asked. "Helping Emma, paying for my medical bills, staying involved in our lives. What do you want from us?" The question was fair, and Richard realized he owed James Collins the truth. Not the whole truth, not yet, but at least part of it. "I want to help because I found Emma alone in a blizzard and she could have died," Richard said simply. "I want to help because no child should have to hide her pain to protect her parent, and I want to help because—" He paused, struggling with words. "Because sometimes the universe gives us a chance to do something right, and we don't get many of those chances." James studied Richard's face for a long moment. "And that's all?" Richard met his gaze steadily. "That's all." It wasn't all, of course. But it was all Richard could say without revealing the crushing weight of his guilt, the knowledge that he bore responsibility for James Collins' suffering. That conversation would come later, when Emma was safe and healthy and strong enough to handle whatever came next. For now, Richard Wellington, the man who had spent decades putting profit over people, was learning what it meant to put everything on the line for someone else's child. And despite the fear gnawing at his gut about Emma's test results, despite the complicated web of guilt and responsibility that connected him to this family, Richard knew he had never felt more purposeful in his life. The little girl who had looked at him with such trust in the middle of a blizzard was teaching him how to be human again. And whatever it cost him, his fortune, his reputation, his carefully ordered life, Richard Wellington was determined not to let her down. The test results arrived 3 days later on a Tuesday morning that dawned clear and cold. Richard sat in the hospital corridor, his expensive suit wrinkled from sleeping in uncomfortable chairs, his usually perfect appearance disheveled. He had barely left the hospital since Emma's tests began, much to the confusion of his staff and the grudging respect of the medical team. "Doctor." Martinez approached with a folder in her hands and an expression that made Richard's blood run cold. Behind her walked Dr. Andrew Chen, a pediatric neurologist who had been called in as a specialist. Richard stood immediately, his heart pounding with a dread that felt like drowning. "Mr. Wellington," Dr. Martinez said quietly, "is Mr. Collins available? We need to discuss Emma's results with both of you." Richard's throat went dry. "James is with Emma in the playroom. I'll get him." The playroom was a small space filled with donated toys and books, designed to keep sick children entertained during their hospital stays. Richard found James sitting on the floor with Emma, helping her color in a princess coloring book. The sight of them together, father and daughter sharing a simple, peaceful moment, nearly broke Richard's resolve to tell James the truth about their connection. "James," Richard said softly, "the doctors want to speak with us." James looked up, and Richard saw his own fear reflected in the younger man's eyes. They both knew that when doctors wanted to speak with parents privately, the news was rarely good. "Emma, sweetheart," James said gently, "can you keep coloring while Daddy talks to the doctors? Mr. Richard and I will be right back." Emma nodded solemnly. At 7 years old, she had already learned to read the worried expressions of adults, to sense when the grown-ups needed to have serious conversations without her. "Is it about my headaches?" "We're just going to figure out how to make you feel better," James promised, kissing the top of her head. The small conference room felt suffocating as the 4 adults took their seats. Dr. Martinez placed Emma's file on the table, her hands steady despite the gravity of what she was about to reveal. "Gentlemen," she began, "Emma's MRI has revealed a brain tumor. It's located in her frontal lobe, and based on its size and characteristics, we believe it's been growing for several months." The words hit James like a physical blow. He made a sound, half gasp, half sob, and his face went white. Richard felt the room spin around him, the carefully controlled world he had built threatening to collapse entirely. "Is it?" James couldn't finish the question. "It's operable," Dr. Chen said quickly. "The location is challenging but not impossible. However, this type of surgery requires a very specific specialist, and the recovery process will be extensive." "But she'll be okay?" James asked desperately. "If she has the surgery, she'll be okay?" "Doctor." Martinez exchanged a glance with her colleague. "The tumor is aggressive, Mr. Collins. Without surgery, Emma has perhaps 6 months. With surgery performed by the right specialist, her chances improve dramatically, but we're still looking at a complex procedure with significant risks." "What kind of risks?" Richard heard himself ask. "Potential cognitive impairment, motor function issues, or in the worst case." Dr. Chen's voice trailed off diplomatically. "She could die," James finished flatly. "All surgery carries risks," Dr. Martinez said gently. "But without intervention, the outcome is certain. With surgery, Emma has a fighting chance at a full life." James buried his face in his hands. "How much?" he asked in a muffled voice. "How much will the surgery cost?" The question hung in the air like a death sentence. Richard knew, without asking, that the answer would be astronomical. Hundreds of thousands of dollars, possibly more. The kind of money that James Collins, a man living in his car, could never hope to raise. "The specialist we're recommending is Dr. Elena Vasquez at Johns Hopkins," Dr. Chen said carefully. "She's one of only 3 surgeons in the country with experience in this type of pediatric tumor removal. The surgery alone would cost approximately $300,000, not including preoperative preparation, post-operative care, or potential complications." James made another sound, this one like air being forced from his lungs. Richard watched the man he had once fired, the man whose life he had destroyed with casual indifference, crumble under the weight of impossible choices. "I don't have that kind of money," James whispered. "I don't have any money. I can't save my daughter." "Insurance," Dr. Martinez began. "I don't have insurance," James said bitterly. "I lost my job 6 months ago, and I lost my insurance with it. I've been applying for Medicaid, but the paperwork, the waiting lists." Richard felt something break inside his chest. The man sitting across from him was facing every parent's worst nightmare, and it was Richard's fault. If he hadn't terminated James Collins, the man would still have his job, his insurance, his ability to provide for his daughter's medical needs. Emma was dying because Richard Wellington had chosen profits over people. "There are other options," Dr. Chen said gently. "Charity care, medical research programs, fundraising." "How long?" Richard interrupted. "How long do we have to arrange the surgery?" "Ideally, within the next 2 weeks," Dr. Martinez replied. "The tumor is growing rapidly. Every day we delay reduces Emma's chances of a full recovery." 2 weeks. Richard's mind raced through calculations, phone calls he could make, strings he could pull. $300,000 was pocket change to him, less than he spent on art for his office walls. But this wasn't about money. This was about the fact that he had created this situation, and he was the only one who could fix it. "I'll pay for it," Richard said quietly. The room fell silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sounds of hospital life. James looked up at Richard with an expression of disbelief and something that might have been hope. "I'll pay for everything," Richard continued, his voice gaining strength. "The surgery, the specialist, the recovery, whatever Emma needs. She'll have the best care available." "Mr. Wellington," James said carefully, "I can't accept that. It's too much. I could never repay you." "I'm not asking you to repay me," Richard said. "I'm asking you to let me help save your daughter's life." James stared at him for a long moment, searching Richard's face for hidden motives, for the catch that surely had to exist. "Why?" he asked finally. "Why would you do this for us? We're strangers to you." Richard felt the weight of the truth pressing against his chest like a physical force. He had planned to wait, to tell James about their connection when Emma was healthy and safe, but sitting in this sterile conference room, watching a good man face the destruction of everything he loved, Richard realized he couldn't hide behind lies anymore. "We're not strangers," Richard said quietly. "James, 6 months ago, I signed the order that terminated your employment at Wellington Technologies." The words dropped into the silence like stones into deep water. James's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, recognition, understanding, and finally, a carefully controlled rage. "You," James said, his voice barely above a whisper, "you're the one who fired me." "Yes," Richard said simply. "I am." James stood up slowly, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. For a moment, Richard thought the younger man might hit him, and honestly, he would have deserved it. Instead, James just stared at him with eyes that held years of accumulated pain and betrayal. "You destroyed my life," James said, his voice shaking with controlled fury. "You took away my job, my insurance, my ability to provide for my daughter. We lost our apartment. I've been living in my car. Emma has been hiding her pain because she knows I can't afford to take her to a doctor. And now you want to play the hero?" "James," Richard began. "Don't!" James cut him off. "Don't you dare try to justify this. You didn't just fire me, Mr. Wellington. You threw away 200 people like we were nothing. Like we didn't have families and bills and lives that mattered. You never even knew our names." The accusation hit Richard like a physical blow because it was absolutely true. He hadn't known James Collins's name when he signed the termination order. The man had been nothing more than a line item on a spreadsheet, a number to be eliminated to improve quarterly profits. "You're right," Richard said quietly. "You're absolutely right about everything. I fired you without knowing who you were or caring about the consequences. I made a business decision that destroyed your life, and I never gave it a second thought." "Then why?" James demanded. "Why do you care now?" Richard looked through the conference room's small window toward the playroom, where Emma sat alone with her coloring book, unaware that her life hung in the balance. The little girl who had looked at him with such trust in the middle of a blizzard, who had called him good when he hadn't been good in decades. "Because I found your daughter dying in a snowstorm," Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. "Because she looked at me like I was someone worth saving, and I realized I hadn't been that person in a very long time. Because when I discovered who she was, I understood that the universe was giving me a chance to fix something I had broken." James slumped back into his chair, the fight going out of him as quickly as it had come. "This isn't about fixing anything," he said bitterly. "You can't undo what you did to my family by writing a check." "You're right," Richard agreed. "I can't undo the past. but I can make sure that Emma gets the surgery she needs. I can make sure that your daughter lives to grow up and have a family of her own." "And then what?" James asked. "You disappear back to your mansion and your billions, and we're supposed to be grateful? We're supposed to forget that you're the reason we're in this situation in the first place?" Richard had no answer for that, because James was right again. There was no neat resolution to this mess, no clean way to balance the scales of justice. Richard Wellington had destroyed this family's life, and now he was their only hope for salvation. The irony was almost too cruel to bear. "I don't expect forgiveness," Richard said finally. "I don't expect gratitude. I just expect you to let me save your daughter's life, because it's the right thing to do, regardless of who I am or what I've done." The doctors had sat in uncomfortable silence during this exchange, clearly unsure whether to stay or leave. Dr. Martinez finally cleared her throat, gently. "Gentlemen," she said, "I understand that you have complicated history, but right now, Emma's health is what matters most. Mr. Collins, regardless of your feelings about Mr. Wellington, he's offering to provide the medical care your daughter needs. As Emma's physician, I strongly urge you to accept his help." James closed his eyes and took a shuddering breath. When he opened them again, Richard saw a broken man making an impossible choice. "If I accept your help," James said slowly, "I need your word that this isn't some kind of game to you. I need to know that you'll see this through until Emma is healthy, no matter what it costs or how long it takes." "You have my word," Richard said immediately. "And I need you to understand something," James continued, his voice gaining strength. "I will never forgive you for what you did to my family. I will never be grateful to you for fixing a problem you created, but I will let you pay for Emma's surgery because she doesn't deserve to die for our mistakes." The words stung, but Richard accepted them. They were fair, honest, and probably more than he deserved. "I understand," Richard said. "And James, for what it's worth, I'm sorry. I'm sorrier than you'll ever know." James nodded curtly, then stood up. "I need to go tell Emma that we're going to make her headaches go away." As James left the conference room to return to his daughter, Richard remained seated with the doctors, feeling simultaneously lighter and heavier than he had in years. He had finally told the truth, and while it hadn't brought forgiveness or redemption, it had cleared the air between them. Dr. Martinez leaned forward, her expression concerned. "Mr. Wellington, are you certain about this commitment? This surgery is just the beginning. Emma will need months of recovery, possibly additional procedures, ongoing medical monitoring." "Whatever she needs," Richard said firmly. "Money is not an issue." Dr. Chen nodded approvingly. "Then I'll contact Dr. Vasquez immediately. With your resources, we can have Emma in Baltimore within the week." As the doctors left to make arrangements, Richard sat alone in the conference room and thought about the strange journey that had brought him here. 3 days ago, he had been a man who measured his worth in stock prices and quarterly profits. Now he was responsible for the life of a 7-year-old girl whose father would never forgive him. But as he watched through the window, as James gathered Emma into his arms and whispered something that made her smile, Richard realized that forgiveness wasn't what mattered. What mattered was Emma's laughter, the way she colored outside the lines without worry, the trust she had shown a stranger in a blizzard. Richard Wellington had spent 30 years building walls around his heart, but a little girl in a red coat had torn them all down in a single night. Now he had the chance to prove that the man she had seen in him, the good man she had believed him to be, actually existed. He wouldn't waste it. Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore was a monument to medical excellence, its halls filled with the kind of quiet urgency that spoke of life and death decisions made with scientific precision. Richard had arranged for a private jet to transport Emma and James from Chicago, along with a medical team to monitor Emma during the flight. It was the kind of extravagance that normally would have made James bristle with pride and resentment. But the urgency of Emma's condition had stripped away such luxuries as wounded pride. Dr. Elena Vasquez was a woman in her early 50s with silver-streaked hair and hands that moved with the confidence of someone who had performed miracles for a living. She had agreed to see Emma on 2 days' notice, a favor that Richard's influence and financial commitment had made possible. In the world of elite medicine, money didn't just talk, it sang opera. "Emma is a remarkable little girl," Dr. Vasquez said, reviewing the test results in her office while Emma underwent pre-operative scans. "Her tumor is aggressive, but she's young and strong. Those are advantages we can work with." Richard and James sat across from the surgeon's desk, the tension between them temporarily set aside in the face of their shared concern for Emma. Over the past week, they had developed an uneasy truce, polite cooperation born of necessity rather than forgiveness. "What are her chances?" James asked, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. "If the surgery goes as planned, I'm optimistic about Emma's full recovery," Dr. Vasquez replied. "The tumor's location is complex, but I've successfully removed similar growths in 7 other children over the past 5 years. 6 of them are now living completely normal lives." "And the 7th?" Richard asked quietly. "Doctor." Vasquez's expression remained professionally neutral, but something flickered in her eyes. "Surgery is never without risk, Mr. Wellington. We do everything possible to minimize those risks, but I believe in being completely honest with families about all possible outcomes." James leaned forward in his chair. "What kind of risks are we talking about specifically?" "The tumor is near areas that control speech, memory, and motor function," Dr. Vasquez explained. "In the worst-case scenario, Emma could experience deficits in any of these areas. There's also the standard surgical risks: infection, bleeding, reaction to anesthesia." "But without surgery," James pressed. "Without surgery, Emma has perhaps 3 months," the surgeon said bluntly. "The tumor is growing rapidly and will soon begin affecting vital brain functions." The stark choice hung in the air between them. Risk everything to save Emma's life, or watch her die slowly over the next few months. For a parent, it wasn't really a choice at all. "When can you operate?" Richard asked. "Tomorrow morning," Dr. Vasquez replied. "We've already scheduled the surgery for 7 a.m. It will take approximately 8 hours, possibly longer depending on what we find once we're inside." 8 hours. Richard tried to imagine sitting in a waiting room for 8 hours while surgeons operated on Emma's brain, not knowing whether she would wake up as the same bright, trusting little girl who had changed his life. "I'd like to speak with Emma before the surgery," Dr. Vasquez continued. "Children her age understand more than adults often realize, and I've found that honesty, delivered appropriately, helps them cope better with medical procedures." They found Emma in the pediatric ward's playroom, building an elaborate castle out of colored blocks with the intense concentration that children brought to important projects. She looked up when they entered, her blue eyes immediately reading the serious expressions on the adults' faces. "Is it time to fix my head?" she asked, with the matter-of-fact acceptance that had been breaking Richard's heart for days. Dr. Vasquez knelt beside Emma's block castle, admiring the architectural details. "That's a beautiful castle, Emma. Tell me about it." "It's a safe place," Emma explained seriously. "All the people who live there are protected from bad things. The walls are really strong, and there's always enough food, and nobody ever has to be scared." Richard felt his throat tighten. Even in her imagination, Emma was creating refugees from the uncertainty and fear that had marked her young life. "That sounds like a wonderful place to live," Dr. Vasquez said gently. "Emma, I'm a special doctor who fixes problems inside people's heads. Tomorrow morning, I'm going to help fix the thing that's been giving you headaches." Emma nodded solemnly. Will it hurt? You'll be asleep during the operation, so you won't feel anything, Dr. Vasquez promised. When you wake up, you might be a little sore, like when you fall down and get a bruise, but we'll give you medicine to make you feel better. And then my headaches will go away? That's what we're hoping for, the surgeon said honestly. Sometimes these operations work perfectly, and sometimes they're a little more complicated, but I'm very good at what I do, and I'm going to take excellent care of you. Emma considered this information with the seriousness of a much older person. Daddy, she said, turning to James, are you scared? James's composure cracked slightly. A little bit, he admitted. But I'm not scared because I don't trust Dr. Vasquez. I'm scared because I love you so much. I'm a little scared too, Emma said, reaching for her father's hand. But Mr. Richard says that brave people can be scared and still do what they need to do. Richard felt a jolt of surprise. He didn't remember saying that to Emma, but apparently his words had made an impression. The little girl was quoting his philosophy back to him, using his own advice to find courage in the face of something that would terrify most adults. Mr. Richard is right, Dr. Vasquez said, smiling at Richard with approval. Being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you do the right thing, even when you are scared. Emma nodded, then looked directly at Richard. Will you be here when I wake up? The question hit Richard like a physical blow. This child, whose life hung in the balance because of choices Richard had made, was still asking for his presence, still trusting him to be there when she needed him. Yes, Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. I'll be here. Promise. I promise. That evening, Richard found himself in the hospital chapel, a place he hadn't visited since his mother's funeral 20 years earlier. The space was quiet and dimly lit, designed to provide comfort to people facing medical crises. Richard wasn't a religious man. He had long ago concluded that the universe was governed by market forces rather than divine intervention. But tonight he found himself drawn to the peaceful atmosphere. James Collins was already there, sitting in the front pew with his head bowed. Richard hesitated, unsure whether his presence would be welcome, but James looked up and nodded slightly. Not an invitation exactly, but not a rejection either. I haven't been in a church since Sarah's funeral, James said quietly, as Richard sat a respectful distance away. I was pretty angry at God after she died. Couldn't understand why a good person like her had to suffer, while people who caused pain got to live comfortable lives. The implication was clear, but Richard didn't take offense. James Collins had every right to be angry at the universe's sense of justice. I'm not sure I believe in God, Richard said honestly, but I believe in Emma. I believe that she deserves every chance we can give her. James turned to look at Richard, his expression unreadable in the chapel's dim lighting. Can I ask you something? Of course. When you fired me, when you signed that order that destroyed my family's life, did you know? Did you know that I had a sick wife and a little girl who depended on me? Richard closed his eyes, the weight of the question settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. No, he said quietly. I didn't know anything about you. You were just a name on a list, a number on a spreadsheet. I made that decision based on salary costs and department efficiency. I never considered that you were a real person with a real family. How many others were there? How many other families did you destroy without knowing their names? 217. Richard said immediately. I remember the exact number because after I met Emma, I looked it up. 217 people whose lives I changed with a signature, and I never knew any of their names or stories. James was quiet for a long time, processing this admission. What happens after Emma's surgery? He asked finally. Assuming everything goes well, what happens to us? Do you disappear back to your world of board meetings and stock prices? Richard had been asking himself the same question for days. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I know that I want to be part of Emma's life, but I understand that you might not want me around. I know that paying for her medical care doesn't make us friends or family. I know that I can't buy forgiveness." "No," James agreed quietly. "You can't." They sat in silence for several more minutes, two men bound together by love for the same little girl and separated by a history that couldn't be undone. "But," James said eventually, "Emma cares about you. For reasons I don't entirely understand, she trusts you. And after tomorrow, she's going to need all the people who love her to help her get better." It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't even friendship, but it was an acknowledgement that their lives were now permanently intertwined, whether they liked it or not. "Whatever happens," Richard said, "I want you to know that meeting Emma saved my life. I don't expect you to care about that, but I want you to know it's true." James nodded slightly. "She has that effect on people. Even when she was tiny, even when Sarah was dying, Emma could make people smile just by being herself. She sees the good in everyone, even when it's buried pretty deep." "She saw good in me when I couldn't see it in myself," Richard said. "I hope I can live up to what she believes about me." "For her sake," James said quietly. "I hope so too." As they left the chapel together, Richard realized that tomorrow would determine more than just Emma's medical future. It would determine whether Richard Wellington could truly become the man that a 7-year-old girl believed him to be. Whether he could transform from someone who destroyed lives into someone who saved them. The little angel in the snow had already performed one miracle by melting the ice around his heart. Tomorrow, Richard would discover whether miracles came in pairs. The surgery began at 7 a.m. on a Thursday morning that dawned grey and cold, Baltimore's winter sky offering no hint of the hope or despair the day might bring. Richard and James sat in the surgical waiting room, surrounded by other families facing their own medical crises, all of them united in the peculiar agony of placing their loved ones' lives in someone else's hands. Richard had never experienced this kind of powerlessness. In his business world, every problem had a solution that could be purchased, negotiated, or forced through sheer will. But in the sterile corridors of Johns Hopkins, his wealth and influence meant nothing. Emma's life depended entirely on Dr. Vasquez's skill, and all Richard could do was wait. James sat across from him, staring at his hands, occasionally checking his phone for messages that never came. They had barely spoken since arriving at the hospital at 5 a.m., their tentative truce from the chapel replaced by the shared anxiety that made conversation impossible. "Mr. Collins, Mr. Wellington?" A surgical nurse appeared in the waiting room doorway. "Dr. Vasquez asked me to update you. Emma's surgery is proceeding normally. They've successfully accessed the tumor site, and everything looks good so far." 2 hours into an 8-hour procedure. Richard felt marginally better, though he knew the most dangerous parts of the surgery were still ahead. "Can you tell us anything else?" James asked. "Dr. Vasquez will provide more detailed updates as the surgery progresses," the nurse replied kindly. "Emma's vital signs are strong, and she's responding well to the anesthesia." After the nurse left, silence descended again. Richard found himself thinking about the past 2 weeks, how completely his life had changed since that snowy night when he'd found Emma. His assistant had been fielding increasingly frantic calls from board members, worried about his absence from crucial meetings. His lawyers were concerned about the legal implications of his involvement with the Collins family. His accountant had questions about the enormous medical expenses he was incurring. But for the first time in his adult life, Richard Wellington genuinely didn't care about business. Let the board members panic. Let the lawyers worry. Let the accountants count costs. None of it mattered compared to the little girl whose life hung in the balance 3 floors above them. "I keep thinking about the night I found her," Richard said quietly, breaking the silence. She was so small in all that snow, but she wasn't afraid. Even when she was lost and freezing, she wasn't afraid because she believed someone would help her. James looked up from his hands. Emma's always been like that. Even when Sarah was dying, even when we lost our apartment, she never lost faith that things would work out somehow. Where does that kind of faith come from? Richard asked. How does a 7-year-old who's lost her mother and watched her father struggle still believe in happy endings? I think it comes from love, James said thoughtfully. Sarah used to tell Emma stories every night. Not fairy tales with princes and castles, but stories about regular people who found ways to help each other, who chose kindness over selfishness, who made the world a little bit better just by being good. Even after Sarah died, I kept telling Emma those same stories. Richard felt something twist in his chest. And I was the villain in those stories, the selfish businessman who destroyed families for profit. Maybe, James admitted. But people can change, right? That's what all the best stories are really about. People choosing to become better than they were. Before Richard could respond, his phone rang. The caller ID showed his assistant's number, and normally Richard would have answered immediately. Instead, he declined the call and put the phone on silent. Whatever crisis demanded his attention could wait until Emma was safe. James noticed the gesture. Important call? Nothing's important right now except Emma, Richard said simply. 4 hours later, Dr. Vasquez appeared in the waiting room, still wearing her surgical scrubs. Her expression was carefully neutral, the practiced mask of a surgeon who had learned not to reveal outcomes through facial expressions. "Gentlemen," she said, sitting down across from them, "the surgery went very well. We were able to remove the entire tumor with clear margins, and Emma's brain tissue looks healthy. She's in recovery now, and her vital signs are excellent." Richard felt his knees go weak with relief. James made a sound that was half laugh, half sob, and buried his face in his hands. "She's going to be okay?" James asked, his voice muffled. "The surgery was a complete success," Dr. Vasquez confirmed. "Emma will need several weeks of recovery, and we'll monitor her closely for any signs of complications, but I'm very optimistic about her full recovery." "When can we see her?" Richard asked. "She's still unconscious from the anesthesia, but you can see her in about an hour. She'll probably sleep for several more hours, but her brain activity is normal, and all indicators suggest she'll wake up as the same bright little girl you know and love." As Dr. Vasquez left to check on other patients, Richard and James sat in stunned silence, the weight of relief almost as overwhelming as the fear had been. Emma was going to live. The little girl who had changed both their lives was going to grow up, go to school, make friends, fall in love, have children of her own. "Thank you," James said quietly, turning to Richard. "I know I said I'd never be grateful to you, but thank you for saving my daughter's life." "She saved mine first," Richard replied. "I should be thanking you for raising such an extraordinary little girl." An hour later, they stood beside Emma's bed in the pediatric ICU, watching her sleep peacefully, despite the bandages wrapped around her head and the various monitors tracking her recovery. She looked impossibly small and fragile in the hospital bed, but her color was good and her breathing was strong and regular. "Daddy?" Emma's voice was barely a whisper, but it was the most beautiful sound either man had ever heard. "I'm here, sweetheart," James said, gently taking her hand. "Mr. Richard is here too." Emma's eyes fluttered open, still drowsy from the anesthesia, but alert enough to recognize them. "Did the doctor fix my head?" "Yes," Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. "Dr. Vasquez fixed everything, no more headaches." Emma smiled weakly. "Good, my head feels funny, but not hurty." "That's the medicine making you feel funny," James explained. "It'll wear off soon, and then you'll feel much better." "Mr. Richard," Emma said, turning her gaze to him, "you stayed. You promised you'd be here when I woke up, and you stayed." "I always keep my promises to you," Richard said, gently stroking her hair around the bandages. Emma's eyes were already drifting closed again, the effort of staying awake too much for her healing brain. "Love you both," she murmured as she fell back asleep. The words hit Richard like a physical blow. This child, who had every reason to fear and mistrust adults, had somehow found room in her heart to love the man who had nearly destroyed her family. It was forgiveness of the purest kind, not because Richard deserved it, but because Emma's capacity for love was greater than any hurt that had been done to her. Over the following weeks, as Emma recovered in the hospital and then in a private rehabilitation facility that Richard had arranged, something remarkable happened. Richard found himself not just paying for Emma's care, but becoming genuinely involved in her daily life. He read her stories when James needed to sleep. He brought her coloring books and puzzles to keep her occupied during the long hours of recovery. He learned to braid her hair when the nurses were busy with other patients. James watched this transformation with growing amazement. The cold, calculating businessman who had destroyed his life was becoming something else entirely. A man who could be patient with a cranky child, who could laugh at silly jokes, who could provide comfort when Emma had nightmares about the surgery. "You're different now," James observed one afternoon, as they watched Emma work with a physical therapist to regain her balance and coordination. "Emma changed me," Richard said simply. "I spent 30 years thinking that success meant accumulating wealth and power. Emma taught me that success means being someone worthy of a child's love." "What happens when she's fully recovered?" James asked. "What happens to us?" Richard had been thinking about that question for weeks. "I'd like to offer you your job back," he said carefully. "Not the same position. A better one. Senior software architect with a salary that reflects your skills and experience. Full benefits, including the best medical insurance available." James was quiet for a long time, watching Emma laugh with her physical therapist. "And the strings attached?" "No strings," Richard said. "Just a man trying to make amends for his past mistakes and hoping to be part of a little girl's future." "I'll think about it," James said, but Richard could hear the acceptance in his voice. 3 months later, Emma Collins walked out of the rehabilitation facility completely healed, her blonde hair growing back over the barely visible scar from her surgery. She skipped between her father and Richard, holding both their hands, chattering excitedly about starting second grade and making new friends. Richard Wellington had entered that hospital a billionaire who measured his worth in stock prices and quarterly profits. He left us something infinitely more valuable, a man who had learned to measure his worth in the trust of a 7-year-old girl and the gradual forgiveness of her father. The little angel in the snow had taught him the most important lesson of his life, that the greatest wealth was not in what you could accumulate, but in what you could give away. That the highest success was not in the empires you could build, but in the lives you could save. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, the life you saved might just save you in return. Emma Collins had looked at a stranger in a blizzard and seen not the ruthless businessman who had fired her father, but the good man he could choose to become. Her faith had transformed Richard Wellington from someone who destroyed families into someone who protected them. As they walked toward their new life together, not as strangers thrown together by circumstance, but as a chosen family bound by love and second chances, Richard realized that the storm that had brought them together had been the best thing that ever happened to him. Because sometimes the universe sends a 7-year-old angel to teach a lost soul how to find his way home. And sometimes, if that soul is willing to listen, the angel's lessons can last a lifetime.